The mind frequently sleeps in the comfort of absolute certainty until the cold wind of doubt shakes the very foundations of existence. Chapter 1. The Crisis of Knowledge and the Awakening from Dogmatism. Welcome to my philosophy channel. This video might be long, but if you stay until the end, you may finally understand the true nature of human knowledge, freedom, and the limits of reason. If everything we know comes from experience, why can we speak of universal truth? If the world follows strict laws, how can humans be free? Before we confront these terrifying questions, we must first observe the man who dared to ask them. Immanuel Kant was born in 1724 in the modest German city of Königsberg. History remembers him as a rigid academic who lived like a perfectly calibrated mechanical clock. Citizens supposedly set their pocket watches by his afternoon walks. Yet this popular image conceals a profoundly complex human reality. Beneath the predictable exterior of this methodical philosopher burned a fierce intellectual curiosity. He grew up within a devout household belonging to a strict religious sect. His father was a master harness maker who taught him the value of meticulous craftsmanship and unerring dedication to daily labor. During his early intellectual development, he was entirely captivated by the majestic discoveries of Isaac Newton. The rationalist philosophers of his era believed that the human mind could uncover all universal truths through pure logical deduction. They assumed that human reason was an invincible instrument capable of piercing through the mysterious veil of the physical cosmos. In 1755, the young thinker published an ambitious treatise regarding the origin of the universe. He proposed that the entire solar system emerged from a spinning cloud of primordial cosmic dust. By relying purely on the invisible forces of attraction and repulsion, he explained the majestic choreography of the heavens without requiring immediate divine intervention. This bold scientific theory demonstrated his supreme confidence in the power of abstract rationality. Humanity desperately craves certainty amidst the chaotic unpredictability of daily existence. The early Kant believed that the logical mind could map the entire universe just as safely as one navigates the familiar streets of a hometown. The illusion of complete knowledge provided deep comfort. However, a dangerous contradiction remained hidden beneath this beautiful rational architecture. If the human mind can dictate the eternal laws of nature without ever leaving the comfort of an armchair, are we merely dreaming up elaborate fantasies? We assume our thoughts perfectly mirror objective reality. But what if our perception deliberately distorts the things we observe? He later referred to this early phase of unquestioning intellectual arrogance as his dogmatic slumber. The rationalist tradition had built magnificent castles in the air, constructing flawless logical systems that lacked any tangible connection to the bleeding reality of Earth. Philosophy had become a complex game of abstract concepts divorced from the raw friction of human experience. Consider the dangerous arrogance required to believe that the mind alone contains the complete blueprint of the universe. When we rely exclusively on pure logic, we often spin elaborate web-like structures that are completely invisible and unverifiable. Human nature desperately yearns for the safety of absolute principles, actively rejecting any evidence that challenges our precious internal paradigms. The rationalists assumed that a higher power had pre-programmed the human soul with innate ideas that perfectly matched the external world. This divine guarantee provided a convenient philosophical shield against the terrifying abyss of absolute uncertainty. But relying on a metaphysical guarantee is merely an intellectual evasion, a desperate attempt to avoid confronting the frightening void of our own profound ignorance. Modern society frequently suffers from the exact same intellectual blindness. We construct perfect economic models and flawless computer algorithms, arrogantly assuming that these artificial structures entirely capture the messy essence of human behavior. Whenever we mistake our clean theoretical maps for the dangerous and unpredictable territory of actual life, we are sleeping in our own dogmatic slumber. Deep within the quiet solitude of his study, he began to experience a profound existential anxiety. If the grand theories of traditional metaphysics were merely unverifiable speculations, then the entire foundation of Western thought rested upon weak shifting sand. The predictable ticking of his beloved clocks suddenly echoed like a dreadful warning, reminding him that time was running out. He realized that philosophy was rapidly becoming an endless battlefield where abstract thinkers ceaselessly argued over unprovable concepts like the immortal souls and the divine first cause. Without a solid anchor in physical reality, these endless debates functioned merely as intellectual gymnastics without any genuine purpose. He recognized that a devastating reckoning was quickly approaching his quiet city. To awaken from this comfortable intellectual coma requires a brutal psychological shock. For over a decade, the philosopher maintained his predictable routine while silently wrestling with the terrifying possibility that everything he believed was fundamentally flawed. The majestic machinery of classical physics seemed invincible, yet the silent seeds of utter, epistemological devastation were already beginning to sprout. We only begin to seek genuine truth the exact moment we realize our safest beliefs might be beautiful lies. Chapter 2. The Shock of Skepticism and the Collapse of Certainty. The illusion of absolute knowledge shatters when we finally dare to question the invisible threads connecting our reality. For decades, the brilliance of rationalist philosophers like Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and Christian Wolff illuminated the German intellectual landscape. They promised a universe governed by flawless mathematical logic, where human reason could safely unlock the deepest secrets of God and nature. Immanuel Kant had faithfully subscribed to this majestic philosophical architecture, believing that the human mind possessed an innate map of the entire cosmos. This intellectual comfort zone remained unchallenged until a cold philosophical wind blew across the English Channel. The Scottish philosopher David Hume delivered a devastating critique that shook the very foundations of Western thought. Hume argued that all human knowledge must derive exclusively from direct sensory experience. He brutally dismantled the grand rationalist illusion that we could understand the world through pure abstract reasoning alone. To understand the terrifying implications of skepticism, let us conduct a simple mental experiment. Imagine you are standing beside a smooth green billiard table, carefully watching a white cue ball roll swiftly toward a stationary red ball. Your mind immediately anticipates the loud crack of impact. You assume, with absolute certainty, that the white ball will strike the red ball, causing it to move forward. But Hume forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. How do you actually know that the second ball will move? You might answer that you understand the universal laws of physics and cause and effect. However, Hume relentlessly presses further, pointing out that you do not actually see any invisible force transmitting power from the first object to the second object upon their direct physical impact. All you genuinely experience through your naked senses is a sequence of isolated events. First, you see the white ball rolling. Second, you see the two objects touching. Third, you see the red ball moving away. You never actually witness the hidden causal connection itself. Hume declared that our belief in cause and effect is not a rational certainty, but merely a psychological habit forged through repeated observation. We assume the sun will rise tomorrow simply because it has risen every previous morning. But past experience cannot logically guarantee future outcomes. If causality is just a psychological illusion created by human habit, then the entire magnificent edifice of Newtonian physics might rest upon a fragile subjective foundation. The majestic universe suddenly reduces to a chaotic series of unconnected sensory perceptions floating through an empty void. When Immanuel Kant finally read the devastating arguments of David Hume, he experienced a profound intellectual earthquake. The unshakable certainty that had guided his entire academic career evaporated almost instantly. He famously confessed that it was Hume who awoke him from his dogmatic slumber, forcing him to confront the terrifying possibility that human reason genuinely held no objective power over the physical world. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that the solid floor beneath your feet is merely a painted canvas stretched over a bottomless abyss. This was the exact psychological terror the philosopher faced inside his quiet study. If Hume was right, then objective scientific knowledge was completely impossible. Science would be nothing more than a collection of useful guesses, utterly stripped of any universal or necessary truth. The philosophical landscape was suddenly split into two equally terrifying extremes. On one side stood the dogmatic rationalists, arrogantly building invisible castles in the sky using pure logic divorced from reality. On the opposite side stood the radical empiricists, trapping humanity inside a dark prison of disconnected sensory experiences, denying the very existence of universal truth. Both paths seemed to lead directly toward intellectual ruin and perpetual ignorance. Human nature inherently despises the cold vacuum of uncertainty. When our most cherished beliefs are threatened by radical skepticism, we often react with blind anger or willful ignorance. We desperately cling to our familiar paradigms because a flawed map still feels safer than having no direction at all. Yet, true intellectual courage demands that we stare directly into the abyss of doubt without flinching or surrendering to easy comforts. Kant refused to let human knowledge die on the altar of skepticism. He treasured the remarkable achievements of modern science too deeply to dismiss them as mere psychological habits. He knew that the universal force of gravity was real and that the planets moved according to strict mathematical laws. He recognized that a completely new philosophical framework was desperately needed to rescue science from the claws of doubt. To save reason from itself, he had to embark on the most ambitious intellectual journey in human history. He needed to dismantle the entire structure of human cognition and examine every single hidden gear and invisible spring. He realized that before we can arrogantly claim to understand the external universe, we must first rigorously investigate the hidden mechanisms and absolute limitations of our own knowing mind. True enlightenment only begins when we courageously watch our most cherished certainties burn to ashes. The deepest mysteries of the universe are not hidden within the stars, but within the very mind that observes them. Chapter 3. The question, how is knowledge possible? After the devastating shock of radical skepticism, Immanuel Kant found himself standing amidst the absolute ruins of Western philosophy. He could neither return to the arrogant dreams of the dogmatic rationalists, nor surrender to the dark despair of the extreme empiricists. A profound intellectual deadlock paralyzed the academic world, demanding an entirely new method of investigation. He realized that to save science, he must interrogate the knower. Before we can confidently declare what is real or illusory, we must first ask a much more fundamental question. How is human knowledge even possible in the first place? We routinely make bold claims about the vast external world, yet we rarely stop to examine the delicate internal machinery formulating those very claims. He understood that philosophy had dangerously ignored the intricate architecture of human cognition itself. Imagine wearing a pair of glasses with blue lenses firmly fixed to your face since the exact moment of your birth. Whenever you look at a majestic mountain or a simple cup, everything naturally appears blue. You might falsely conclude that the entire universe possesses an intrinsic blue quality. However, the color exists entirely within your own unremovable apparatus of perception, not within the cold independent objects. This powerful metaphor captures the essence of his revolutionary epistemological inquiry. For thousands of years, philosophers blindly assumed that the human mind passively reflected the external world like a perfectly smooth mirror. They believed that knowledge was simply the act of capturing reality exactly as it exists independent of the observer. But what if the mirror actively shapes and distorts every single image it ever attempts to reflect? He proposed that our intellect is not a passive receptacle waiting to be filled with raw sensory data. Instead, it operates as an extremely active and demanding filter. Every fragment of information traveling through our biological senses must first pass through a highly specific cognitive architecture. If a particular raw sensation cannot be processed by this inherent mental structure, it simply cannot be perceived by human consciousness. Therefore, the eternal conflict between reason and experience was fundamentally misguided. The rationalists were wrong to believe that the mind could generate absolute truths without the messy input of the physical world. Simultaneously, the empiricists were deeply mistaken in assuming that raw sensation alone could organize itself into meaningful scientific laws. Knowledge requires a perfect marriage between the blind data of experience and the guiding light of reason. Thoughts without content are completely empty, while intuitions without concepts remain utterly blind. This brilliant formulation bridged the terrifying chasm that had divided human thought for centuries. We need the chaotically flowing river of sensory experience to provide the raw material of existence. Yet, we equally need the rigid mental banks furnished by our intellect to channel that raging water into a comprehensible stream of navigable reality. This realization forced him to write the Critique of Pure Reason, a monumental project dedicated to establishing the exact boundaries of legitimate understanding. He set out to draw an unforgivable border between what we can scientifically know and what we must humbly leave to silent speculation. He decided to map the geography of reason itself, preparing to launch what he would proudly call his own Copernican Revolution. We do not passively discover the laws of nature. We actively command nature to speak our own cognitive language. We are not merely visitors in the universe, but the silent legislators who write its most foundational laws through the act of perception. Chapter 4. The Discovery of A Priori Structures. How does the mind construct a reliable map of reality when the sensory territory is constantly shifting like desert sands? Kant recognized that if all our knowledge merely followed experience, we could never claim any universal or necessary truths. He realized that there must be a fundamental set of rules already dwelling within us, existing long before we ever open our physical eyes. These hidden intellectual foundations are what he formally identified as the a priori structures of human cognition. Unlike knowledge gained from fleeting observations, these truths are entirely independent of experience and possess absolute certainty. Think of the eternal laws of mathematics or geometry. You do not need to measure every triangle in the universe to know its internal angles. Total 180 degrees. He proposed that our mind functions not as a silent mirror, but as a powerful legislative body for the natural world. We do not simply find the laws of physics scattered in the forest like fallen leaves. Instead, our intellect imposes these rational laws upon the chaotic sensory data we receive. We are the hidden architects designing the very structure of the reality we perceive every day. This revolutionary discovery effectively ended the ancient and exhausting war between the strict rationalists and the radical empiricists. Kant proved that, while experience provides the raw material of life, reason provides the necessary form. Without the biological senses, we would have nothing to think about. Yet, without the inherent mental structures, our thoughts would be meaningless fragments of disconnected noise, floating in the dark void. We often assume that truth is something outside of us waiting to be discovered, yet it might be something we weave ourselves. By looking inward, he found the universal anchor that could finally stabilize the drifting ship of human knowledge. He transformed the knowing subject from a passive victim of circumstance into the supreme commander of its own reality. We finally understand that we define the world. The architecture of the universe is not something we observe from a distance, but a palace we build from within. We measure the universe with clocks and yardsticks, forgetting that the true instruments of measurement reside exclusively within our own minds. Chapter 5. Space and Time as Forms of Intuition. When we open our eyes to observe the majestic world, we are instantly flooded with an ocean of raw sensory data. Colors, sounds, and textures crash against our biological receptors in a chaotic storm of information. Yet, we never actually experience true chaos. Our perception always arrives perfectly organized. How does the human intellect instantly tame this raging storm of sensation into a comprehensible and stable picture of reality? For generations, brilliant scientists like Isaac Newton firmly believed that space and time were absolute physical realities. They pictured space as a massive, invisible, and empty container that held every planet and star. They imagined time as an eternal river, flowing continuously forward, completely independent of human existence. This dogmatic view comforted humanity, suggesting that the dimensions we inhabit were permanent fixtures of the cold, objective, and eternal universe. Immanuel Kant dared to challenge this invincible scientific paradigm through a remarkable thought experiment. He asked us to imagine any physical object, perhaps a heavy stone or a wooden chair. Now, try to strip away all its physical properties. Remove its color, its weight, and its texture. You can successfully imagine the object without these features, but you can never imagine the object existing entirely outside of space. Space cannot be merely a concept derived from external experience, because every single experience already requires space simply to exist. If space were merely learned from observing objects, how could we process the very first object? He concluded that space is not an independent cosmic container, but a fundamental a priori form of human intuition. It is the unremovable biological lens through which we must perceive everything external. He then directed his razor-sharp analytical gaze toward the fleeting phenomenon of time. Consider any event you have ever experienced, from the sudden flash of bright lightning to the slow blooming of a spring flower. You can effortlessly imagine an entirely empty time without any events occurring within it. However, you genuinely cannot ever imagine any event occurring utterly outside the sequential flow of time itself. Time governs the internal state of the human mind with absolute and unforgiving authority. Every thought, memory, and emotion unfolds along a strict timeline of past, present, and future. Therefore, time is not an invisible river flowing through the empty cosmos. It is the inherent operating system of human consciousness, actively formatting every internal phenomenon and external sensation into a comprehensible chronological sequence that our intellect can effectively process. The implications of this philosophical discovery are absolutely terrifying and profoundly beautiful. Space and time do not exist independently out in the cold void of the universe. If humanity were to suddenly disappear tomorrow, the majestic concepts of spatial geometry and temporal chronology would vanish instantly along with us. We carry the massive dimensions of reality exclusively within the intricate and invisible architecture of our own fragile biological brains. Modern society obsessively attempts to conquer space through advanced aviation and master time, through precise atomic clocks. We constantly rush through our brief lives, anxiously chasing future deadlines while regretting past decisions. We mistakenly believe that these dimensions are brutal masters punishing us from the outside. Yet Kant gently reminds us that we are actually fighting against the fundamental rhythms and geometries projected entirely by our own active consciousness. Even modern theoretical physics frequently echoes this astounding Kantian revelation. As quantum mechanics uncovers the bizarre behavior of subatomic particles that defy traditional spatial locations, we are reminded that our intuitive human lenses are severely limited. We cannot force the entire infinite cosmos into the narrow constraints of our specific biological operating system. Our familiar reality is merely a highly specific translation of an unknowable and utterly alien universe. We are the silent architects imprisoned within a magnificent dimensional fortress built entirely by our own imagination. The mind does not simply receive reality. It actively forges it within the invisible furnaces of human understanding. Chapter 6. Categories and the Architecture of Understanding. Space and time provide the ultimate canvas and the sequential clock for our experience, but they remain entirely silent. If we only possessed these basic intuitive forms, the universe would simply appear as a meaningless blur of shapes and colors floating through the void. The human mind requires another magnificent faculty to translate this organized sensory geometry into genuinely comprehensible and useful conceptual knowledge about the world. Immanuel Kant identified this higher faculty as the human understanding. While our sensibility passively receives the raw data of intuition, our understanding actively synthesizes that data using specific inherent concepts. He called these foundational concepts the 12 categories of the understanding. These are not rules learned from observing nature. They are the hidden intellectual molds into which all natural observations must be poured before we can consciously recognize them. Consider the terrifying skepticism of David Hume regarding the invisible phenomenon of cause and effect. Hume correctly observed that we never actually see causality out in the physical wilderness. Kant entirely agreed with this empirical observation, but he reached a radically different and revolutionary conclusion. We do not extract the concept of causality from the world because we have already imposed it upon the world before making our observation. Another essential category imposed by our understanding is the concept of substance. When you observe a burning piece of wood slowly turning into gray ash, your senses only report a continuous series of visual changes. Yet your mind intuitively knows that the underlying matter has not magically disappeared into absolute nothingness. The inherent category of substance forces you to interpret this transformation as a change in physical state. The 12 categories function exactly like an intricate network of intellectual scaffolding. They provide the universal architecture necessary to support every single judgment we ever form about reality. Whether we are counting 3 apples or predicting a solar eclipse, we are silently utilizing categories like plurality, necessity, and relation. Without this a priori conceptual blueprint, we could never formulate any coherent sentences or comprehend basic scientific laws. This monumental synthesis between sensibility and understanding forms the absolute bedrock of human cognition. The senses hand over the spatial and temporal data, while the understanding stamps this data with universal concepts. Reality is the magnificent symphony generated only when these two distinct cognitive faculties play in perfect unison. We construct our rational world by constantly filtering the raging chaos through these 12 silent and invisible conceptual gates. We can observe a brilliant reflection of this Kantian architecture within modern computer science. An artificial intelligence system requires both a massive database of raw information and a highly structured processing algorithm to function correctly. The database represents human sensation, while the rigid algorithm mirrors the 12 categories. Without the governing algorithm imposing strict logic, the tremendous volume of encoded data remains an utterly meaningless and useless ocean. However, this remarkable discovery also carries a profound and sobering limitation. Because our entire experience must be relentlessly processed through these specific human categories, we can never claim to know the universe exactly as it exists entirely independent of us. We are inescapably trapped within our own brilliant architecture. We can only comprehend what the strict laws of our human understanding permit us to see and categorize. The most magnificent prison ever constructed is the one built utterly invisible by the strict laws of our own brilliant logic. The greatest triumph of human reason is the humbling recognition of its own absolute boundaries. Chapter 7. The Limits of Reason and the Thing in Itself. Through the monumental synthesis of sensibility and understanding, Immanuel Kant successfully rescued scientific knowledge from the terrifying abyss of radical skepticism. He proved that the universal laws of nature are completely valid because they are the intricate laws projected by our own human cognition. However, this magnificent epistemological victory carried an incredibly heavy and unavoidable philosophical price. If our brilliant intellect only processes information by relentlessly filtering it through the rigid structures of space, time, and the 12 categories, then a terrifying consequence emerges. We are categorically forbidden from ever knowing the true universe as it exists entirely independent of human observation. We only ever experience reality after it has been thoroughly translated by our minds. This unavoidable realization led Kant to formulate the most famous distinction in the entire history of Western philosophy. He divided reality into two completely separate dimensions. The first is the phenomenal world, which consists of everything we can actually see, measure, and understand. This is the familiar realm of scientific investigation, human experience, and mathematical predictability. The second dimension is the noumenal world, also known as the realm of thing in itself. This represents the ultimate reality that exists behind the curtain of human perception. It is the absolute source of all sensory data, yet it remains forever hidden from our direct intellectual grasp. We can logically assume it exists, but we cannot describe it. To grasp this profound limitation, imagine staring at a magnificent rainbow arching across a darkening sky. The rainbow seems beautifully real, yet it only exists due to the specific interaction between sunlight, falling raindrops, and the precise biological structure of your human eyes. If you remove the human observer, the visual phenomenon of the rainbow instantly vanishes into absolute nothingness. The entire tangible universe operates exactly like that ephemeral rainbow. The mountains, the oceans, and the distant stars are all beautiful phenomena, constructed by our own cognitive architecture. The thing in itself remains standing silently in the absolute darkness of the noumenal void. Whenever we arrogantly attempt to pull back the universal curtain, we only discover another human mirror. For thousands of years, traditional metaphysics arrogantly ignored this impenetrable boundary. Philosophers endlessly debated the exact nature of the immortal soul, the origin of the infinite cosmos, and the mind of God. Kant brutally declared that these magnificent concepts reside entirely within the unknowable noumenal realm. Therefore, pure reason completely fails whenever it attempts to grasp these divine subjects. This severe epistemological boundary might initially feel like a devastating intellectual defeat for the ambitious human spirit. However, Kant viewed this exact limitation as the ultimate philosophical liberation. By deliberately destroying the arrogant illusions of traditional metaphysics, he permanently silenced the dogmatic thinkers. He famously declared that he had to deny knowledge in order to make room for genuine faith. We must willingly surrender the arrogant illusion of absolute knowledge before we can finally awaken the silent power of moral freedom. The heaviest chains are never forged from iron, but from the unbreakable laws of physical determinism. Chapter 8: Freedom, Morality, and the Inner Law. If the phenomenal world operates according to strict mathematical principles and unforgiving cause and effect, then human existence appears profoundly tragic. Every single action you take, from lifting a coffee cup to choosing a lifelong partner, could be explained as a mere biological reaction. We are reduced to complex flesh machines operating blindly within an indifferent cosmic clockwork. Where exactly can genuine freedom exist in such a rigid universe? Immanuel Kant discovered the ultimate escape route hidden within his own epistemological boundary. Because we only perceive the world through human categories, the cold determinism of physics only applies to the realm of phenomena. The hidden noumenal world, the mysterious dimension of the thing in itself, remains completely untouched by temporal and spatial constraints. Within this unknowable shadow realm, the majestic concept of human free will can logically survive. While pure reason fails to prove the existence of freedom, practical reason demands it as an absolute necessity. When you feel the deep psychological burden of guilt after telling a painful lie, you instinctively acknowledge that you could have chosen the truth. If we were truly nothing more than programmed biological machines, the heavy agony of moral regret would be an utterly meaningless and illogical glitch in our human system. To exercise this precious freedom, we must act according to an inner law written by our own rationality. He called this supreme moral principle the categorical imperative. It is not a conditional suggestion based on personal desire or cultural convenience. It is an absolute command dictating that you must act only according to that maxim through which you can, at the same time will, that it become a universal law. Consider a scenario where you desperately need money and falsely promise to repay a generous friend. Your immediate instinct might justify this deception as a necessary survival strategy. However, if everyone universally decided to make false promises whenever they needed money, the very concept of a promise would instantly self-destruct. No one would ever believe anyone again, causing your specific deceptive strategy to become completely illogical and impossible. True moral worth, therefore, never resides in the consequences of our actions, nor in transient emotional sympathies. If you help a starving beggar simply because it makes you feel warm and virtuous inside, you are merely satisfying a biological inclination. Genuine virtue occurs only when you perform a difficult action exclusively, out of pure respect for the absolute moral duty, even when every single fiber of your being resists. This unforgiving rational architecture leads directly to the most beautiful ethical declaration in Western philosophy. Humanity must always be treated as an ultimate end in itself, and never merely as a disposable means to achieve another goal. Modern corporations routinely violate this sacred principle by calculating human employees as expendable operational costs. We constantly reduce breathing individuals into mathematical statistics, erasing their inherent absolute dignity just to maximize blind profit. In pure rational autonomy, he elevated the human species far above the brutal biological hierarchy of nature. We are the only creatures capable of reigning in our wild animal desires in order to submit to a law authored entirely by our own minds. This extraordinary capacity for self-legislation is the defining mark of human nobility, transforming a fragile mortal body into an indestructible beacon of rational light. The highest form of human freedom is not doing whatever you desire, but willingly choosing to do what is absolutely right. The bridge between the cold laws of nature and the absolute freedom of morality is discovered through the astonishing experience of beauty. Chapter 9. Judgment, Beauty, and Purpose. After mapping the rigid architecture of scientific knowledge and the unyielding demands of moral law, Immanuel Kant faced a profound philosophical fracture. The human soul seemed dangerously torn between two completely incompatible worlds. We live under the cold deterministic rules of physics, yet we carry the absolute command of spiritual freedom within our rational minds. How can these two entirely different dimensions ever reconcile within a single unified human experience? To bridge this terrifying gap, he turned his piercing intellect toward the mysterious realm of aesthetics and teleology. When we observe a magnificent blooming rose, we do not evaluate its specific biological function or calculate its potential market value. We experience what he called a disinterested pleasure. Pure beauty captivates our mind entirely through its exquisite form, completely divorced from any practical utility or selfish animalistic desire. When you declare that a masterpiece of art is truly beautiful, you are not simply stating a personal preference like choosing your favorite food. You intuitively demand that every other rational observer must agree with your judgment. This peculiar phenomenon reveals a universal harmony shared deep within human cognition. Beauty gently whispers that the external world is miraculously tuned to resonate perfectly with our internal cognitive faculties. However, nature does not always present itself as a harmonious and peaceful garden. What occurs within the human mind when we confront the terrifying majesty of a raging ocean storm or stare up at an impossibly massive mountain peak? He identified this overwhelming sensation as the sublime. Unlike pure beauty, which delivers immediate harmonious joy, the sublime generates a deeply complex psychological journey through initial fear and resistance. He divided this extraordinary experience into two distinct categories known as the mathematical and the dynamical sublime. The mathematical sublime overwhelms us through absolute infinite magnitude, like gazing at countless stars or staring at the Great Pyramids. Our visual imagination utterly fails to grasp the sheer size. The dynamical sublime terrifies us through raw destructive power, unleashing violent lightning strikes and massive hurricanes that emphasize our severe physical vulnerability. In the immediate presence of such astonishing destructive power, our fragile biological bodies feel entirely insignificant and easily destroyed. Yet, precisely, at the climax of this physical terror, a magnificent internal reversal occurs. We suddenly realize that while the raging storm can easily annihilate our mortal flesh, it cannot ever crush our independent moral autonomy. Our rational capacity to comprehend the infinite proves superior to any blind natural force. Therefore, the sublime does not actually reside in the violent ocean or the towering mountain peak. The true sublime exists exclusively within our own invincible human reason. This thrilling aesthetic encounter ultimately revalidates our highest human dignity. We look at the blind mechanical universe and realize that we are the ultimate masters of meaning, projecting our own inherent moral purpose onto the cold and indifferent canvas of nature. This profound synthesis ultimately allowed Kant to see the universe, not as a meaningless clockwork mechanism, but as a grand theater designed specifically for the realization of human freedom. The ability to appreciate beauty and experience the sublime proves that we are not merely tragic prisoners of physics. We are the noble inhabitants of two distinct worlds, capable of finding meaning through the brilliant exercise of sovereign judgment. We truly master the terrifying forces of nature only when we recognize that our inner rationality is vastly more powerful than any storm. The ultimate destination of all philosophy is not the cold stars, but the warm, beating heart of the human being who looks up at them. Chapter 10. The Meaning of Being Human. Immanuel Kant embarked on the most ambitious intellectual expedition in human history. He tore down the arrogant castles of dogmatic rationalism, rescued objective science from the dark abyss of skepticism, and mapped the absolute boundaries of human reason. Yet, the supreme goal of his entire critical project was never merely academic. He systematically destroyed our illusion of ultimate knowledge specifically to create an unbreakable sanctuary for our moral freedom. Through his eyes, we finally understand the profound paradox of human existence. Physically, we are infinitesimal specks of dust, tragically bound by the cold, deterministic laws of gravity and biology. But rationally, we are absolute sovereigns, capable of legislating universal, moral laws and experiencing the breathtaking majesty of the sublime. We are the unique bridge between the silent mechanical universe and the divine realm of absolute rational purpose. This philosophical revelation is desperately needed in our hyper-technological modern society. We constantly surrender our sacred autonomy to invisible algorithms, allowing digital machines to dictate our desires, our ethics, and our daily choices. Kant warns us that when we stop thinking for ourselves and blindly follow external commands, we forfeit the very essence of our humanity. We willingly step back into a self-imposed intellectual immaturity. His famous definition of enlightenment remains a timeless battle cry for the human soul. Dare to know. Have the courage to use your own understanding. It is a lifelong, grueling demand to refuse the easy comfort of blind obedience and to embrace the terrifying, magnificent responsibility of sovereign rational thought. It is the arduous, unending path of truly growing up as an independent and free human species. His philosophy teaches us that the universe is not something that passively happens to us. It is a magnificent reality that we actively construct, navigate, and morally command. If this deep exploration into the architecture of the mind has enlightened your perspective, please like this video and subscribe to my philosophy channel. We will relentlessly continue to decode the profound ideas that secretly shape our complex human existence. Are you bravely living as the sovereign author of your own moral universe, or are you simply reading a meaningless script written entirely by someone else?